All right, here we go. So, Flute
Okay.
Examiner friends and subscribers, thank you very much for joining us. We have a really kind of cool and a little bit of a fangirl interview for me. Um, Most of you know this brilliant composer, two operas, multiple works for orchestra, wind ensemble, chamber music, keyboard, voice, and even music for a ballet. Lowell Liebermann, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you
So,
so much.
I've written out some questions here and we'll go with the flow. So whatever happens,
Okay.
happens. Um,
Terrific.
so you're quite an accomplished pianist. You premiered at Carnegie Hall at age 16, but tell us a little bit about you, the person, not the composer or musician. What would you like your average person, or what do your friends know about you that you can share with us?
There's very little I can share. It's all very dark. No, oh, I don't know. I'm just kind of a normally abnormal person, I think.
I can live with that. That's a good response. It's fair. It's very fair. Um,
You know.
any anything that you have like as a hobby or something that you really enjoy doing that's not music?
Yeah, when I'm decompressing and trying to get away from the music, I actually love, the kind of home repair thing and renovating things and fixing things. Um, I'm into art. I'm into, literature. Just all kinds of things. I mean, my garden when the weather permits.
Wonderful.
Um, yeah, so no, they're really, the music unfortunately doesn't often leave a lot of time for extracurricular activities, so one has to really carve them out when one can.
Would you say just because we have a lot of professional musicians, aspiring professional musicians, would you say that those hobbies and those distractions that you enjoy help keep you mentally sane in like the hustle and
Oh
bustle?
yeah, no, I think you have to. I think you have to get away from just the one focus. And I think all kinds of things, the other arts, just life activities enrich you as a human being and therefore enrich your music. So I do think it's important to be well-rounded, and that's something, a well-rounded person in terms of culture and interests and just knowledge of other cultures and things. And I that's something I try and impress upon my students.
I think that's great. That's great. I've learned that myself that sometimes I've got to go work in the wood shop or I'm going to lose my mind. So
Hmm.
that's
Yeah.
why I had to ask. I had to ask. Um, so have you always wanted to be a composer or did you want to be an astronaut when you were like what other things were on your
Um,
list?
I think I first wanted to be a painter. I wanted to be an artist, and I think in a way I was perhaps more of a bit of a prodigy at that than at music. I mean, the art came very easily to me when I was very, very young. And when I started piano lessons at about the age of 8, I think it took over. It was more interesting because in a way it was more challenging and more difficult. And there was a brief period when I wanted to be an archaeologist. I think every kid wants to, find Tutankhamun's tomb at some point. But then the focus really became the music, and actually, when I was about 13, I declared to my parents that I wanted to be a composer.
Oh wow. Wow, that's
Uh,
young.
by
That's
by
young.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it is.
That's crazy.
And I meant it. I'm not sure why, but I did.
For the riches and the fame, of course.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah.
um, so within your compositional background, your musical training, is there a particular composer or work that you could listen to, or that listen to their works on repeat because you're just so taken with them?
That changes. I mean, when I was a student, I would be able to rattle off who my big influences were, and I mean, I think one goes through various phases. It's funny that the older I get, the more and more I'm turning to composers that I didn't pay that much attention to when I was starting out. And like right now, I'm in a deep Schubert phase. I actually just performed Winterreise with a wonderful countertenor, Daniel Moody, and Schubert has become very, very important to me as a composer. Also Mozart, which when I was younger, I used to kind of not exactly dismiss Mozart, but he wasn't. I much preferred Haydn when I was young, you know, and these things sometimes change.
So do you have a guilty pleasure? Like I personally love a cappella music, whether it's pop or otherwise. Is there a specific type of music that is your guilty pleasure that's not of the classical genre per se?
Um, that's a tough one because I'm so focused on what I do and kind of always have been that when I'm not doing that, the last thing I want to do is listen to music.
Yeah,
So there isn't really any music that I don't listen to very actively.
that's fair. That's fair.
Um, but if I had to name like one era of popular music that perhaps I love more than any other, it's kind of the 30s and 40s big band
Mm.
jazz, those just fantastically inventive orchestrations and kind of just some wild stuff there.
Yeah, the voicing is really
Um,
cool in
yeah,
those.
and just beautifully crafted, melodies and things.
Mhm.
So I really do appreciate that. Current popular music, I have to say, there's really not much that grabs me.
Oh, big band music's great. It's
Yeah,
fun. It's fun,
yeah,
and it gets the audiences always love it. There's a large appreciation for that. So I think that's a great answer.
yeah, yeah,
It's so different than what we both of us in classical, and it's so different than what we're used to, plus
yeah,
saxophones. But
yeah,
um,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
so
Well,
you,
it's funny because I'm actually my very next piece is a saxophone concerto.
well, we got to give him some
so,
love too.
so there you go.
That was a great segue. It's almost like it was planned. Um, so you've written a lot of different music for a lot of different instruments, but there's one that sticks out clearly to me because I'm a flute player. But you've written a lot for flute, piccolo. What is it about flute and piccolo that has inspired you or drawn you to write for them?
Well, I think you could rephrase that as what is it about the flute community where they won't leave me alone?
That's fair too. That's fair too.
No, it's funny because it all really started with a commission from the Spoleto Festival for a flute sonata for Paula Robeson and Jean-Yves Thibaudet. And that was my first flute work. And I hadn't really paid much attention to the flute as a solo instrument before that. I had, of course, written for flute in orchestral music and stuff, but um, didn't really have the occasion to write for it as a solo instrument. And so when I wrote that sonata, I wanted to go against my own stereotypes of what I knew of flute music, which was mostly the kind of fluffy French conservatoire pieces, And so I really wanted to go against that and write a really strong, meaty piece for the flute, where also the piano wouldn't be just treated as an accompaniment, where they would be equal partners. And that piece really took off. Um, that was almost immediately followed by my flute and guitar sonata, which took a little more time to take off than the flute sonata. But then Jimmy Galway, now Sir James Galway, um, asked me if I would orchestrate the flute sonata for him so that he could play it with orchestra. And I said to him, well, if you really want me to, I'll do it. But actually, I don't think it will be as effective with orchestra than it is with piano, because especially the last movement, so much of the tension and excitement is actually in the difficulty of the writing for piano and its interaction with the flute. And if you orchestrate it, all of that kind of tension, I think, will be dissipated. So I said to him, I would, I'll do it if you want me to, but I would much rather just write you a new concerto. And he said, okay, I'll commission it. So that was the first flute concerto, which he followed with a commission for the flute and harp concerto. And by that time, the flute sonata was pretty well established as a, contemporary repertoire piece. And so I started getting just a lot of commissions from the flute world, solo flute, chamber music combinations, my two flute trios. Actually, Jimmy commissioned one of the flute trios as a surprise Christmas present for his wife, Jeannie Galway, who's of course also a flutist. So I'm incredibly grateful to the flute world, because so much of my career has been um, due to them.
That's
And
wonderful.
due
Yeah.
due to these commissions and whatnot, and it still continues.
Well, and
Um,
what I think a lot of people don't know, because we know your name on the printed music, but a lot of people necessarily don't know you in person, or as a person. They know you as a
mhm.
composer. I happen to know that you have a warped sense of humor, like a few of us do. Um, and I remember specifically playing the last movement of the Piccolo Concerto is one of my favorites. There's some hauntingly beautiful melodies, and that last movement, I remember specifically playing it or performing it for the entire music department during my master's, just the last movement. And I remember as those little snippets of things would pop up, hearing the student body chuckle. So those snippets that pop up and kind of sneak in, you can hear the harmony kind of changing to give you a glimpse of something, and then it moves away again. What
Mhm.
what inspired those little snippets to pop up? Because I find it so light and funny, and just it's just fun to play.
That's that's something I've done in other pieces. Um, Not so much recently, but there was a period where I was kind of doing that sort of thing every now and then. And my music is rarely programmatic or based on extra musical things. Um, and I'm very, very concerned with kind of unity, what I call an organic unity to the piece, where all the material is related and used and whatnot. And these these quotations come up sometimes when I notice a similarity to the material that I'm using. So if a piece is, built on fifths and thirds and things, it will sometimes remind me, oh, that's built on fifths and thirds, and I'll, sneak in a little quote of that. That actually, I think the first piece I did that in was the flute sonata, where there's a quotation at the end of the first movement from Wotan's Abschied, from Wagner's Ring,
Mhm.
because the little melodic bit of that beginning has the same intervals as the main theme of the flute sonata. So I kind of quoted that as as kind of a sly nod.
Yeah.
And so that's really the case with those quotations, which I then kind of overlay, and they're all heard
Mhm.
simultaneously.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, it's
Um,
I remember the first time I ever heard it, and before I had ever studied it or worked on it, and you could hear, I remember distinctly thinking, "Oh, that's starting to sound like," and then it just popped out and I went, "Oh, there it is."
mhm,
So it was very organic, and it was one of my
mhm,
favorite things to play, and to hear, the students were actively listening and paying attention and saw the nod to the different pieces, especially
mhm.
when you get this little tiny sliver of Sousa that kind of, it's almost tongue in cheek with the piccolo being what it's
Right,
best known
right.
for. So I appreciate that more than I can share. It was just such a great piece to perform. So when you're composing and you're working on something, do you ever hit like a writer's block, as it were? And if so, what do you do to get past that?
Um, when you're working basically full time as a composer, you don't have the luxury of writer's block. You have to deliver something by the deadline, and that's the deadline is always the best inspiration. Um, and this is something I discuss with my students because, when you're in school, when you're writing pieces, you don't have the same kind of professional deadline that you do when you're making a living off of it. And so students often go through this writer's block syndrome simply because they don't really have to get the piece finished. It's not going to so they allow themselves the luxury of self-doubt and of not liking anything they write and whatnot. And when you need to deliver a piece, you have to put the notes down.
Mhm.
And if you don't like what you're putting down, you have to find a way of making it work in a way that you do like. So I really think yeah, and the beginning of every piece is, one could call it writer's block, because I sketch and sketch and sketch and reject all kinds of things and end up with a stack of sketches this high before I finally find the material that I'm comfortable moving forward with. And that usually miraculously coincides with getting quite close to the deadline.
Nothing like a little
So
little bit of pressure to move things along.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if I didn't have deadlines, I don't know how many pieces I would ever finish. Because you always criticize and criticize, and one is never happy 100% with anything. And then when you have to get it done, when you have to finish it, then you look back and you say, oh yeah, that's actually not bad. So it's a funny process.
And
It's not the
I was gonna say the hindsight is the performers always love it, I'm sure, more than you do, because you know all the struggles that went into it. They're just making music out of it. And
Yeah, well, you also you hear the seams that were there,
yeah.
and you know how you know all the dirty backstage business that went into the creating the piece.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Nope. I think it's the same way for the performer too. We know the spot we've had problems on, and we hope it
Hmm.
doesn't rear its ugly head in the middle of a performance. But
Right,
yeah.
right.
So for those who are performing your pieces and working on them, do you have any advice from the composer's mouth to the performer about your works? What do you want them to take in as part of their performance from your works?
Well, I would like them to take in first thing that the markings on the page do mean something. The dynamics, the slurs, it's funny. I grew up musically at a period when there wasn't so much concern about, there weren't really text editions yet. And it kind of was very common for a performer's attitude to be that the notes are sacred, but everything else is your interpretation. So you could just change pedalings or change dynamics, and that would be your interpretation. And as a composer, I've come to believe that actually it kind of works the other way around, that the notes are your filling in of this kind of dynamic emotional framework. And you know, listen, there are different composers who view their music very differently. I've always felt that everything needed to be a very integrated, um, organic thing, and that, you know, if um, if I had a different dynamic in a certain place, I would have written the notes differently too. So, there are things that certain performers do that really annoy me, like taking the last note of the flute sonata up an octave, as if I didn't know that flutes could do that when I wrote it. Um, and I just think that's really tacky. I mean, I wrote it going down for a reason. So yeah, one of the top things is I would love performers to respect what's written on the page. Within that, however, that should not become a constricting thing. You should still play with expressivity and a certain amount of interpretative freedom, which does not mean ignore the markings, but the markings give you room to, for it's fascinating. You can listen to two different performers who play the same piece of music and observe every single dynamic and mark, and yet they're totally different performances.
Absolutely.
So I think there's always room for the performer's personality to emerge, but it shouldn't be at the expense of what's on the page.
I think that's great advice, and it's important because you put those markings there for a reason, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah. So thank you. That's a really helpful piece of information to share. Um, so I this is non-flute related, but I have a colleague who, when she found out I was going to be talking with you, said, "Oh my God, I love gargoyles." What's the
Okay.
story behind Gargoyles? She just loves it, and it's such a fun piece to listen to. But yeah, so I told her I would bring it up, and so now when she watches this, she knows I followed through. Um,
Well,
what's
for those who are listening who don't know what Gargoyles is, it's a four movement set of piano pieces that were written not that long after the Flute Sonata. The Flute Sonata is Opus 23, and the Gargoyles are Opus 29. Uh, to give some context, the latest piece is Opus 142. So, but Gargoyles was a set of four pieces that were commissioned by the Alexander Cherepinin Society, and for this pianist Eric Emy, who was doing a debut at Alice Tully Hall. And I wrote the four pieces without knowing what I was going to call them. And I kept going through all the generic kind of short piano piece titles: impromptus, etudes, preludes, intermezzi, whatever. And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't figure a title out that I liked. And I think I was actually on the last page of music of the piece, writing it, when I looked down, underneath the piano, I had these three little plaster reproductions of the Notre Dame gargoyles from the cathedral in Notre Dame, and I suddenly thought, oh, gargoyles, that kind of fits the music. And it's so funny because I so often get asked, oh, which gargoyles did you base it on, and this, and it absolutely was something that had not entered my mind while writing the music.
Well, it's still a great story. I mean, it's and but that's great. So now my question has been fulfilled, and she can see this and say, there's her question has been asked.
Mm.
Um, so is there any of your opus? Is there any one piece that you've ever stepped back from and heard it performed and gone, wow, I wrote that?
Um, no, because I know I wrote it, and again, when you're listening to it, I mean, I'm always kind of listening to the parts that, oh, I should have done this, or I could have done that, or is that part really as good as it could have been, or it's still kind of always the self criticism going on. But one thing is that I hate going back and trying to rewrite a piece. I've rarely done that. I think I've only done it twice. Um, because I really do think once you get a certain distance from a piece, you are a different person, and you're no longer in the same mental and emotional state when you wrote that piece. And I do think it's a tricky thing going back. And I would much rather spend the time just writing a new piece than going back and trying to, because you could just tinker forever with a piece. You have to know when to say stop, enough, let it be, let it have its own life. Um, it's very, very funny. I always remember when I was a student at Juilliard, and we would give recitals in Hall, which was the little recital hall, and there were a group of um, not exactly homeless men, but people from I think there was some kind of facility where they would kind of medicate them and then let them out on the streets for the day. But they used to come to the recitals and sit there very quietly. And one of them was he was always kind of very elegantly dressed in a suit and tie, except he had very beat up, dirty sneakers. And he came up to me once after a piece and he said, you should write as much music as you can. It doesn't matter if you don't like it, somebody will. And I always, I'm not sure what that even means really, but it's always stuck in my head.
It's sage advice from a stranger.
Well, I'm not sure how sage it actually is, but it sounds like it should be.
It's yeah. Uh, that could be a quote somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's excellent. So this is a loaded question. So if you could go back and give your younger self any advice on anything, what would it be?
Oh God. Um, wow. Oh, there would be a lot actually. Um, First of all, it took me years and years and years to learn how to practice properly. Um, I have to say I didn't have very good training as a pianist throughout almost my entire education. and no one ever really taught me how to practice properly. And that kind of took, because I was always very impatient with myself, and I wanted the pieces to just be there. And I was a very good sight reader, but generally a very sloppy pianist, because I just didn't know how to work the digital, the technical things. And so I would sit myself down as a young student and give myself a very strong talking to about my practicing and stuff like that. Um, it's you know, in terms of the composing career, I don't think there's much I would do differently. Um, because I haven't really wavered from what I believed in as a composer, and I've often got a lot of criticism and flack from people for the kind of music uh, I've been writing, especially starting out when it was almost forbidden to write tonal music. And tonality is something I've always used. I mean, along with atonality and other techniques, but a lot of my music, more importantly, I think, is that my music is always melodically based. And that's something that had become very unpopular for a certain period. And I kind of just always believed in the kind of music I was writing, so I kind of stuck to my guns. So in those terms, there's not much I could say to my younger self except maybe don't let the people who don't like what you're doing bother you so much.
I think we can
Because
all.
whatever you do, and again, I tell this to my students, I tell them no matter what you write, there will be people who love it and people who hate it. And you have to learn to appreciate the people who love what you're doing and just ignore the others.
That's great advice for everybody, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
with that being said, clearly there are a lot of people who love what you're doing because there's something big happening next month. As I recall, March 21st. Would you like to tell our listeners and subscribers a little bit about that?
I can't imagine what you're talking about. Uh, no, March 21st will be the premiere of Flute Concerto Number Two, with uh, the fantastic flutist Stefan Hoskuldson and the Chicago Symphony, conducted by Susanna Malki. So I'm very excited about that. I've wanted to write Stefan a concerto for years. We've been very, very good friends for a couple of decades at least. And I just think the world of him as a flutist. And it's very exciting.
Yes, it is. I know there's a lot of talk about it and a lot of excitement. So congratulations for another upcoming premiere. The flute world clearly loves you because they keep bugging you to write more stuff. Um, and I appreciate you taking the time today to spend some of our Saturday morning chatting about all things flute and not flute related. So thank you
Oh, it's a
again.
pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure.
Hopefully we'll cross paths again at some point in the near future, and I wish you the best of everything, and I wish I could be at the premiere, but unfortunately I can't. We do have a colleague is gonna show up and get to be there for us. So Flute Examiner will be
Great.
represented at least, and she'll report back to us. But I know it'll be a hit, just like everything else. And
Yeah.
thank you again for taking your time this Saturday morning, and despite all the, the fun things that have gone on for both of us this morning, we managed to get here. So,
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
my
Thanks for your patience.
of
Yes.
course, again, premiere of the second flute concerto, March 21st, Chicago Symphony, 7:30 p.m. If you're in the area, please try to get tickets. I'm sure they're going like hotcakes. So, and I look
Yeah,
forward to seeing it in print so I can add it to my collection of music as well. So Lowell, thank you again
great.
very much, and we'll talk again sometime soon.
Thank you.
You
Thank
bet.
you.
Thank you.